Morning. This is David, and I'm going to start. I do want to thank Michael for giving us this opportunity to speak with all of you this morning about the implementation of the CARES Act and some of the work that we're doing in Washington on behalf of our students and our institutions. And it's been a very, very busy time, as it has been with all of you. And we are eager to share with you some of the fruits of what we've done. So with that, I'll just move ahead, and Jihang is going to come on after I've gone through about 8 or 9 of this first slide. So thanks everybody for being with us. Okay, Eileen?
Yep, we're ready.
Next slide.
Hold on.
So this is just a brief overview of the topics that we're going to be covering today. So we can move on now.
My computer's got some lag time. Sorry.
Yeah, it's just a little bit of an overview about the CARES Act, and that is the amount of funding that higher education received. Department of Education received $30.75 billion altogether, which is a little bit more than a third of the department's annual budget. The governors received a share of that money off the top, 10%. The higher education received almost $14 billion. And there is a maintenance of effort provision that's put into the bill, but it has a pretty large loophole in it, excuse me, that is outlined on this slide here. And we would expect that, given the unlikely situation financially the states are going to be confronting, that this is something that most states are going to want to utilize. The maintenance of effort language in the bill does require that you have you maintain your spending on higher education and K-12 education at the previous 3 years levels. The two sectors of education are blended, so in theory, more funding could be put into K-12 and at the cost of higher education. Next. Yeah, the big bolus of money that was provided was to higher education institutions was in the form of 3 different grant programs. The one that I'm sure all of you on this call are aware of, that institutions have already received information about, is the bulk of the funding. It's institutional formula grants. We'll get into that in more detail in just a moment. We also, though, secured 7.5% of the higher education funding for Title III and Title V of the Higher Education Act. The way that works is that each of the programs in those titles receives about 135%, so a little more than 1 1/3 of their funding for fiscal year 20, in addition to that funding. And the department has to, again, provide to each of the programs. Beyond that, the department was not instructed about how to allocate the funds, and they are presently considering how that would be done, how those funds would be allocated, rolled out, whether by formula or competitive grant program or whatnot. And then finally, a smaller program, it's about $349 million, is a competitive grant program at FIPSE for colleges that receive less than $500,000 through the first 2 programs. Next. Okay, so this is a little bit of background on the big program that I mentioned a moment ago, the Formula Grant Program, and just a little bit about how it's structured. The funding includes for-profit institutions as well as graduate and professional students and institutions as well. There are some freestanding graduate and professional schools that are receiving allocations under the program. And that was you know, a policy/political decision. Won't go into it, but I would note that it was this topic of a lot of conversation on Capitol Hill. There are people who are leery of money going to particularly for-profit institutions, given their nature, but they were ultimately included in the allocations. half of the funds, and these are the half of the funds that are now being made available to institutions, are for emergency financial aid for students. The language, though, goes on to say that it's for additional expenses that students incur as a result of the pandemic. So things like transportation, technology, childcare, in some cases, if it were to be tuitions, additional charges from institutions, those are the expenses that are supposed to be covered by the 50% of this funding, the formula funding. I'll make one other note about that, and we'll get into this in a moment in implementation, I'm sure, but that it should be understood what I just said about what the funding is to be provided for and the way that the language in the bill is written is as I've put it. However, at the same time, there's clearly a desire and need for students to receive this funding on the basis of their financial circumstances. The department's guidance in this area told institutions to take into account financial need. There was suggestions about limiting the grants to the Pell Grant maximum, which implies a Pell-type focus on students. So I just want viewers to be aware, listeners to be aware that there's a very sort of specific statutory description of what these funds are supposed to be used for. It is arguably a little bit at variance the way they will in practice be deployed. And in a few minutes, I can read that language to you when I get a break and get onto another screen if anybody's interested. Importantly, the institutions have, as I implied a minute ago, broad discretion about allocating money to students. There are a variety of different possibilities and policies that institutions might use to award funds, whether it's for again, solely on the basis of need, whether they want to do it on an across-the-board basis, whether they want to do it on the cost of programs for institutions that have differential programs, whether they want to focus on a given need that students might have, like a technology grant or what have you. All these things are subject to institutional discretion. However, one of the things that the guidance that was released on Thursday, last Thursday, indicates is that funds are not to be used for retroactively repaying for institutions, even for charges that the institution applied to students in response to COVID-19. So I know in one case, not in Florida, an institution required all of its students to enroll in online off-campus programs. Those programs carry with them a technology fee. That technology fee has been assessed, but at least according to the guidance that the department supplied last week, because those charges were made in advance of these funds becoming available, they wouldn't be coverable by those. That is also falls in the same category as I think most of you are aware that institutions are not able to use these student funds for institutional refunds that they may have given earlier or not in any circumstance for tuition money or in some cases room and board funding that was rebated to students. The program that we're talking about is a formula-based program. It's driven by two different populations. One is the Pell Grant population, and each Pell FTE is weighted at 0.75. Each non-Pell FTE, so everybody else, is at 0.25. And out of that, covering all of higher education, as mentioned, is what led to the institutional allocations, with the exception that all entirely online students before the pandemic hit are excluded from this funding formula. And that was very clearly designed to impact disproportionately the for-profit sector, which, as you all know, does exclusively or is generally overwhelmingly in the for-profit sector. And I'm just going to throw out, since I just saw it mentioned there's a question about non-credit students, and as far as we can tell, the answer is yes, non-credit students are eligible to receive their funds. There's nothing in the law, the CARES Act, or anything in the guidance that the department has issued which would appear to preclude that. Next, Eileen. computer really doesn't want to let this formula go, does it?
It does not. Hold on. Really likes it. There we go. Sorry.
Thank you. So this is just a little bit more about what I talked about a few minutes ago in terms of the Title III and the Title V programs. There's not a lot more to add beyond that. Again, half of the funding at least has to be allocated to students. The use of the funds is broad that institutions receive through this. The money can be awarded in addition to any formula grant funds that colleges have received. But again, at this point, the Department of Education hasn't indicated how it plans to distribute these funds. Not necessarily surprising given the amount of new programmatic responsibility they have at a time where, like everybody else, they are working remotely. Next slide, please. And this is, again, the smallest program. For those of you, and I didn't go and check the list of Florida institutions, I know you have a number of very large colleges. I don't know if any are such small that you would have received less than $500,000. There are not many community colleges that did. But if that's the case, then you would be eligible to apply directly for a grant for COVID-19 related expenditures. Again, half the money would have to go to students. And this is a potential vehicle for at least some of our institutions. These are just some of the other programs that were provisions that were included in the CARES Act. I think the most notable of them is the Dislocated Workers Assistance Reserve, which will ultimately provide some additional funds for training at community colleges through the WIOA structure. TANF funding has been extended, and the nursing and allied health programs were also reauthorized in the course of the bill. Next, please.
David, I'll do this slide.
Yeah, please.
Okay, perfect, thanks. Good morning, everyone. I think it's still morning for everybody on the East Coast. So I'm gonna do some of the student aid provisions and walk you through some of the regulatory relief that was provided to higher ed institutions. As obviously you know, compliance with federal regulations on federal student aid can be complicated. So therefore, a number of things have happened as part of this and the CARES Act. So R2T4, as it's commonly known, will not be triggered relative to students that are withdrawing relative to COVID-19. I would only stress that if students withdrew earlier in the term and this was not specifically related to COVID-19, R2T4 would still trigger for these students. The other thing I just want to forewarn you about is that I know in Florida, typically when a student has an R2T4, there is a bill that's placed on their account for the tuition and fees or the cost. So that's something that maybe that you have to look in within your internal policies to waive that for these particular students. SAP was modified to reflect the impact. You know, we are fortunate that there were a number of changes to a federal work study. We know that our work study students that are working on our campuses can't work on our campuses since they're not allowed to work on our campuses. So the modifications were made for that. And then the SUOG awards can increase up to the Pell Grant maximum. So there were a number of changes that we were very happy that Congress, and even some of these changes were being brought about by the Department of Education in the midterm. Eileen, can you forward a slide for me? Thank you. Another thing that David and I have been watching about, and we have some concerns, is relative to the loan program, the federal loan program. All federal loans don't need to be paid for. It's basically mandatory forbearance until the end of the fiscal year, which is September 30th of 2020. Interest won't accrue. Collection of defaulted loans is also stopping, and those individuals that were collected upon are having their resources returned. I will note, though, that many of these students that are in repayment, they will likely come back into a different fiscal year, cohort year. So this is one of our priorities for Congress to deal with, and we'll talk about it at the towards the end when we're talking about our priorities. And also, Pell received during this period of enrollment won't be impacted by the emergency, will not be counted against the lifetime limit. So we know that students are experiencing acute financial, emotional, physical, they might not have housing. So Congress is not counting this period of time in the lifetime limit. Next slide, Eileen.
Yeah.
Okay. Other tax provisions, the student debt up to $5,250 can be paid tax-free by the employers, charitable deduction for non-itemizers. There is a $150 billion state fund that colleges can access. You've all heard probably about the $350 billion in small business loans. And this is those institutions that could be eligible would be those that have fewer than 500 employees. You've also probably have heard, since it's been in the news quite a bit heavily, they are pretty much tapped out of that $350 billion. So therefore, Congress, Senate Majority Leader McConnell is working on getting some additional resources for that $350 billion. Next slide. So these are some of these regulatory actions that I talked about. So the department initiated some, and then CARES Act came in on top of them. So just as a guidance for all of you, most of these flexibility provisions remain in effect until June 30. These are the ones that the department initiated. This is one that's relatively important for all of you. This is the so distance education was approved by the department. It was waived for periods of March 5th to June 5th. So if you have online programs that weren't originally online programs, you're going to need a PPA for those periods of time, for those programs. That's something that was in the, I want to say, early April guidance from the Department of Education in the FAQ, in the IFAP notice that your financial aid offices should have received. There was also guidance for complying with federal disability laws. One thing that we have heard about is the verification process has been complicated because for VA4 and VA5 verifications, you either need to present your some form of government ID to the financial aid office and or get a notarized statement and a copy of your government ID, which obviously both of those seems really complicated to do in this current environment. So therefore they are giving guidance to allow it to be done electronically. And then the forms of ID after March 1st, 2020 will be accepted. As you probably have heard, the Real ID even deadline has been extended because people are, it's going to take a little bit more time for people to get their IDs, considering a couple months of not being able to access DMVs and stuff. Next slide. So David and I could tag team on these recommendations, but obviously from our standpoint, while we were successful in getting billions of dollars for community colleges in the CARES Act, we do know that all of you need additional resources. We also are obviously aware that states are going to be having revenue shortfalls in the near future. And in certain states, they're even clawing back resources from our colleges that have already been budgeted. So what we are looking to do is to get an additional $46.6 billion of resources for all of higher ed. So that pretty much represents over, David, my best math would be around $10 billion would go to community colleges.
Little bit more. We get about a quarter of the funds, so yeah, 12 or so. Yeah.
Yeah, about $12 billion. We under the 12.5, we only received a little over, around a little less than 3 billion. So we're looking to get some additional resources for that, because we do know that many institutions, as they were ramping up to do online, had significant outlays. We had thought that technology purchase for students could be covered under the student emergency aid side. Or at least that was the guidance from Capitol Hill. That turned out to be not true. So therefore, obviously, we're holding a bill that we're hopefully, we're hopeful that we are able to succeed in getting some additional resources for all of you. The other thing that we're working on is relative to job training. We do know, we had thought Congress was interested in doing something more on a short-term basis, but more and more as we have talked internally and with all of you out in the field, we hear all of you talking about what's going to happen with the economy. So we have been proposing a 2-year program funded at $1 billion a year that would be similar to the Trade Adjustment Community College Training Grant Program. We don't necessarily have a Department of Labor or Department of Education or a specific location for it. We're kind of letting Congress fight out that fight, but we are looking to get those resources because we know that once we all open up, we'll have countless number of individuals that are unemployed, that are looking for shorter term programs, so that they can apply for, get the credentials necessary or training to get a job. And in this area for this program, we're also looking to try to get student tuition and fees covered. For those of you who have participated in TACT know that TACT didn't cover student tuition and fees. So this is something that we think is important. We are continuing to have conversations with the Hill about like the structure and the type of programs and type of the length that we would need to make sure this program is successful. David, do you want to cover the last two?
Sure. So we have 3 more proposals, and in our Community College Daily, we did outline all of these ideas that we're advocating for this morning. We are looking to get into the supplemental grant program additional cash for colleges to distribute to students, largely on the basis of need. This is something that Congress has indicated that it might be supportive of, and so we're pushing for this. It would be in addition to the funds that would be going to students through the formula grants that we described a minute ago. We also would like to see something done along the lines of what was undertaken in the wake of the Great Recession in 2009 and 2010. The Department of Education encouraged institutions, and Department of Labor did as well, to and allowed institutions to exclude from income any unemployment benefits that workers were receiving, so that they could more easily qualify for student financial aid. And in general, the one-stop career centers were encouraging students to avail themselves of Title IV, and we'd like to see policies that sort of facilitate that adopted once again, whatever the exact unemployment picture is going to be in the weeks to come. We all know how terrible it is now. In terms of in this area of student borrowing, which is an ongoing priority for Democrats in Congress, as well as some Republicans, but the Democratic leadership has taken a very high profile position on this, in keeping with a number of the presidential candidates. And our focus, ACCT's and my association's focus has been on low-income borrowers. We know that it's our students who have the highest default rates of any sector. They tend to be students who borrowed the least, which generally is correlated with their not having completed their programs. And so we'd like to see whatever kind of forgiveness program might be enacted, which again is probably going to be something that Democrats are going to be pushing for, is something that we want to see focused on the neediest low balance students. And then we would like to see as Jihang mentioned a few minutes ago, the current pause on the repayment of student loans and the accrual of interest extended out beyond through the end of September 30th. We're looking for at least another year in terms of that relief for borrowers. And then finally, something that perhaps doesn't get the level of attention that it might, but is still very important for our students, and that is that along with the American Council on Education, we are supporting some changes to the American Opportunity Tax Credit and the Lifetime Learning Tax Credit that would make it those credits more beneficial for community college students, particularly the Lifetime Learning Credit. And in essence, it's become a very large subsidy for graduate and professional students, $2,000 a year, because they get 20% of whatever tuition they pay. Our students, our non-credit students, get 20% of any tuition that they pay. And also if they're enrolled less than half time. But given community college tuitions, that's not a particularly large amount of money. We'd like to restructure that. So those are our primary proposals as we look at the next stimulus bill. We didn't take time to go into the legislative landscape for that, but suffice it to say that it's quite uncertain at this time. The Democrats in the House have really taken the lead so far on Stimulus 4. There's been some high-level back and forth between Speaker Pelosi and Majority Leader McConnell over, what another stimulus package might look like. Jihang mentioned a few minutes ago that the money for small business, there's a need to plus that up. That may drive some other legislation. At this point in time, the reality is that although there's a feverish amount of activity still on the Hill on addressing COVID-19, the next vehicle timing and the size of it is unclear at this point. One final thing Jihang may want to add to this, but is that if we don't speak up a lot for these priorities, we're not going to get them because, as you, I'm sure, are all well aware that pretty much everybody in our economy, in our society, with a few rare exceptions, is hurting and is asking Congress for relief, and the demands and the requests that are being made of them are, mind-boggling, as was the bill that was already enacted. It was on the first slide that you saw, but maybe it's worth mentioning that the stimulus bill that was the CARES Act was $2.2 trillion, which is more than 10% of the GDP of our country. So they enacted, a tenth of our economy in one fell swoop, and they're looking to spend more money. So we're talking about really big bucks.
Mike, I don't know how you want to do Q&A, but there's a number of questions that Dave and I can start going through and answering on the chat.
Yeah, so
Okay.
If you can see them,
Yeah.
you can scroll right down from the top, and or I can read them out, whatever your preference is.
So I think there's just some general questions about the eligible students that are eligible for the student portion of the awards. We do know that the Department of Education is going to be giving some guidance on that. So my only word of caution is to pause, because there has been questions internally between us and our teams about whether or not, for example, Dreamers, legal immigrants, whether or not international students would be eligible for these cash awards. So the department, I have an expectation the department will provide a little bit of guidance on that. So I just want to flag that for you. David, do you want to cover?
Yeah, I'll do the next one, which is about Pell Grants and the scholarship funds. Will they be in the form of scholarships or another disbursement to them? the college is going to have flexibility in terms of, what shape these grants take, including over what time period they will be dispersed, because institutions have a year to spend these funds. So that's really going to be a campus decision. Colleges are required under the agreement that they have with the secretary to document the individual received the funding, the amount they received, and a little bit about the grounds that were used to determine the student's award. The next one I answered in passing, which is that as far as we can tell, we're not attorneys and our word isn't gospel necessarily, but it does look from us, and it's been confirmed by the department informally, if not in black and white on paper, that that there is an ability for institutions to fund non-credit students with the emergency grant monies.
There's so many questions now. We believe on the institutional side, which we believe will come out probably towards the end of next week. The department, when they announced the student portion, said that the institutional share would be available in 2 weeks. So that would be Thursday of next week. We believe it will come in the same form, which is through the portal that they provided through grants.gov.
The question is about international students. International students, again, is a category that has not been precluded by anything the department has said. So we do believe that institutions would be able to provide support to international students with that emergency grant money. Want to do next?
Yeah, this is the one on incentive funding to help students continue their education in the fall. I think the way that the Department of Education has outlined the student share, they say cash awards. So it would be complicated for you to use that as incentive money if there's no pass through from the student back, from the college to the student, and then student back to the college, if that makes sense.
Yeah, Jihang, I think you might have inadvertently skipped over a couple.
Sorry.
There's one, can students ask for waiving basic tuition under the Act?
Well, I'll take a stab at that because I saw it, and that is that students, the answer is yes. Funding can be used to pay for, tuition expenses under the program. It doesn't have to be just non-tuition expenses.
Yeah, and I would also encourage you, if you haven't alerted your students, given their financial situation, can come back to try to get additional federal aid based upon their situation, whether or not they become unemployed, whether or not their life situation occurs. So they can reach out to your financial aid office for a professional judgment based upon a myriad of issues. And so that's something that your financial aid officers should be doing, or the college should be doing, is alerting students that they might be able to get additional federal aid based upon what's going on right now.
Okay, and you see the one there about the 50% to be used?
Yeah, I thought I covered that one. Sorry, I skipped over the basic one. Yeah, the 50% we believe will be going through the same way as the student allocation that went out. We don't think there will be a different mechanism for that. So be on the lookout for some type of communication towards the end of next week, we think.
Okay, and then we've got one about a little bit more, asking for a little bit more on the lifetime learning tax credits.
Okay.
Yeah. So again, currently students who are eligible for the credit include those who enrolled less than half time and are non-credit students. and these are a big community college population. They only are able to receive or recover 20% of any tuition that they pay or fees that they pay for their courses. And as the name implies, the lifetime learning tax credits is designed for people who oftentimes fall into that category. And so they don't get a large financial benefit from this. Some students claim it, but all our understanding of it is that not heavily used at all by community college students. By comparison, graduate and professional students get the same 20%, but they get up to $10,000 of any of their expenses they have. So they get $2,000, and so they have a great incentive to apply, file for this credit. And so we think that if you're a worker who wants to take a non-credit program at a community college, you ought to be able to get the same amount of your fees recovered as somebody going to graduate or professional school. Same for students just taking one course at a community college and might not be eligible for a Pell Grant. So that's what we're trying to change. We are asking it only be changed on a temporary basis because that's very much what Congress is focused on in this legislation. We didn't emphasize that, but they're really not looking to make permanent policy changes. Having said that, we would like to see this change made permanent, but if we can get our foot in the door by getting this done in this economic crisis, that we'd be very pleased.
So we have a couple more questions here. A couple people asked the same question. Yes, with Jihang and David's permission, we will make the slide presentation available to you. We'll probably post it through the AFC website, and if that's okay with them. And we will also probably make the recording of the entire broadcast available also through the website for follow-on viewing. Moving down, there's a long question regarding more guidance and direction on how we can broadly interpret the statement referring to the latitude for the emergency financial aid grants, the funding and certification agreements that seems to limit the funds for expenses related to disruption of campus operations, et cetera. Can they interpret that to help the largest number of students who need cash to buy food, pay rent, cover utilities, that kind of thing?
Well, I just put my glasses on here in Washington, D.C. because I think it's going to help me answer this question more effectively. The question that is posed is a very good question because the language in the statute does talk about increased cost to students because of the change in instruction as a result of the coronavirus, and it outlines some of the additional expenses that students might have incurred in the law. However, these are emergency grants to students, and all of the clear intention of the Congress and the administration's implementation of this provision and language that came out last week does refer to students' financial situations. And what I'm pointing to here is really in my opinion at least, a somewhat narrowly drafted concept of what these funds should cover that doesn't really reflect the intent of Congress or the way that these grants would work in practice, because in many cases, students are certainly in a much worse financial situation than they were before the pandemic hit and their personal situations changed. Their expenses haven't always increased, although in some cases I described, they have increased. So we think on the basis of the guidance that the department provided that colleges are on solid ground to provide money for students who have been impacted financially negatively, or again in terms of their family situation in various ways, to meet those those new circumstances that wouldn't always necessarily have resulted in additional charges per se. Jihang, do you want to add anything to that?
No, I would just say that, you know, one of the things as you read through the document and your certification, you know, part of this is records retention, is that you have to tell the department how much you gave a particular student, and you also have to outline the process of how you determined. So that would be something that you might start to develop internally. For an example, if you have students that were part-time and they were also they had an occupation, of those students who lost a job, they might be, you know, they might be on the front end of receiving some emergency aid. So I think part of this is to ensure that you have some type of process in place that students are able to come in. Obviously, you know, I don't think nothing precludes a law from you just giving a formula grant to everybody, but obviously that doesn't go very far. And the awards are very low if you do it for every student across the board.
Okay, I see two more questions. The first one is actually kind of two questions. Any idea how long after upload of certification that the advance funds will be available, quote, the student emergency aid in G5? Also, any idea of when the application will be available for the second 50% of the funding?
Yeah, I think I covered the second part. We expect the the announcement of the institutional allocation towards the end of next week. If 2 weeks is the guidance that the department provided last week. As for the additional the resources for the student emergency side, I don't know. I think it was candidly, from what we have gathered, the department wasn't necessarily prepared to receive as many applications and certifications as promptly as it did. So I think they are a little behind. But David, I don't know if you heard anything, but there's been radio silence on when the actual receipt.
Yeah, I have not heard this week.
Yep.
All right, and then finally, Gina, I hope I get this right for you. So these funds cannot be used for scholarships in spring or fall. Instead of a scholarship, I mean a grant.
The end date of the stabilization fund is September 30th of 21.
Right.
So presumably colleges will be able to utilize these resources for fall and spring.
Yes, that's right. The department's the guidance document even refers to staging the funds to students. One of the things that we're wondering about, it would be a good problem to have, but we are, as we mentioned, seeking additional funds through the formula grants that would include student money. So if colleges get more student money, they're going to have those additional funds to spend within, in all likelihood, the same time frame.
All right, we have one more that came in from the chair of our business officers. Does the 1 year start when you draw down the money or when you apply on grants.gov?
I would say presumably, that's an interesting question.
Yeah. I don't know the answer to it.
So the bill language says that funds will remain available to the end of fiscal year 21. So, and then it says they have 1 year from that date to disperse those funds. So presumably there will be a trigger when that will begin. So for those students that you have in the fall of 21, I would presume if you applied and got resources in the next couple of weeks, I don't think you would get it. You would be able to use it for fall students of 21.